Welcome back to TTC. Listen guys, I never said we were smart, alright? Merely that we could on occasion cobble together some dynos that measure the beans in a repeatable way. Our intention this episode was to show the power difference between a tool truck air hammer, which goes for around $385 from Mac in this case, and a more bargain buy but also powerful by reputation, the long barrel air hammer Chief from Harbor Freight, which retails for $140. And I promise we will get there, showing the power difference between retail and tool truck gun designs, but we ultimately needed some backup because, well, yeah, you'll see. Right about now, we'd usually be going over the Doug DeMuro style quirks and features of these two, showing their length comparison, but today we're going to just hop right into the testing because that's going to say a lot more than flapping our jaws will. Our first test is called Max Power, 90 psi measured at the tool while running. Up first is the Mac Tools MPH 1911, generously provided to us by viewer Ryan W. $4,255, right out the gates, already a record in this test from the tool trucks. Maybe there is something to be said about tool truck air hammers being a step above? Let's find out with the Chief CH401LB sent to us by All-Star fan Joe M. $4,695, making gains over the Mac Tools, albeit at the end of the test, and these curves matching in shape pretty close. Here's an example of 3 different long barrel air hammers we previously tested on our last episode. Different power levels for sure, but also very different power delivery on the curve. Not that you'd notice much in real life. Our next test is called Minimum Power, all about trigger control. Same running pressure as before, but just using that trigger alone to try and throttle back the beans as much as possible. Here's the Mac Tools. $731, okay, not the best ever. The trigger feels like it's got a lot of modulation in it and movement that you could ease into minimally, but that piston is just delivering the beans either way. But yeah, still less beans than even some of the short barrel cheap air hammers that were able to throttle back almost nothing. Let's check out the Harbor Freight Chief. $2,554, yes, that's trying to throttle back as much as possible. We feel we had multiple attempts where the tool would sort of enter into a lower power range than this, but just fade out and stop altogether, no matter how much we tried, so this is the best run we could get. I'd say that's the worst trigger that we've ever come across, but that would be ignoring the electronic power switch type that the DeWalt used, which was frankly an unacceptable on-off button and made the same power, heck, sometimes more, despite our best efforts to throttle it back. But yeah, Chief's lucky that DeWalt does exist, otherwise it would be going home with the title here. Our last test series for the moment is best case scenario, higher line pressure, more realistic to shop use environments, and that line pressure drops to whatever it does once we pull that trigger. Here's the Mac Tools. $4,782, a nice bump up in power from the 4250. She seems to like that extra Pixie PSI dust just fine. Next up is the Chief. Here's this best run. $4,898, besting the Mac yet again. Before we provide you a lot more information that's probably going to require us going into witness protection, let's head over to the rank chart for a moment to tally those points. These two are starting at the bottom of our long barrel air hammers for now. You can see their power runs here: minimum power, max power, and BCS. Those get turned into points with BCS runs being more heavily weighted as we are after the most powerful air hammer at the end of the day. So that's 44 and 478, then 47 and 490 points. You can see the kind of force they are generating in pounds against our load cell here in case you're curious about that. Then for power range, this score is all trigger control. The Mac has a lot more range between min and max runs, with just trigger modulation being the difference, and gets 70.5 points. The Chief, well, that trigger's a hot mess, but it still made a lot of power, so that makes up for some of it. It gets 42.8 points. The Mac and Chief are the same length, oddly, with a bit chuck attached, but a little different power. That's 42.3 and 43.4 points. The Mac costs a lot more at 385 and gets a bit of a penalty for that, 5.3 points versus 15 for Chief. That totals 639.1 and 638.2, putting them into second and third place respectively with very similar scores. Are you noticing a trend here? Because we didn't. Seriously, at this point we had used both tools in person, seen their power runs, at least the scores, and tallied their points and thought, oh, that's cool, they're pretty close. That's because these tools are made in the same factory. Yes, it wasn't until much later when putting this episode together and making these power graphs here that we were like, hold on a minute, these are almost a spitting image of each other on the power curve. Look at those. Both of these tools are made in Taiwan, and they weigh the same. Oh, but we're just getting started. If you go to Mac's website, the link for their air hammer manual has been removed, but we were able to find an archived copy online. This diagram on the Chief, does it look familiar? It goes a bit deeper. Look at these part index numbers, 23, 20, 12, 21, 15, 2, a pair of 19 O-rings, and then 22. Switching back, that's 23, 20, 12, 21, 15, 2, a pair of 19 O-rings, and 22. And what's that number 22 called? Looks like a rear cushion, which sandwiches the front shock isolator out front. And over here, a rear cushion with a front shock isolator. Not only are they the same numbers like the rest, exact part names like shock isolator, we've not found that in any other air hammer parts diagram. Look at the 119 Max from IR. I mean, the part images are exact. Look at this number 18 barrel with 26, 25, 14, and 13 pins. Bam. Identical. You've probably already realized this now, but the two tools are a spitting image of each other. Has no one done this side by side before? We couldn't find anything about these being the same online, and no one mentioned it in our comments. When you just look at the images of them, this isn't usually the way you want to compare power tools. There are plenty of copies out there, but it's a spitting image. Except for this little pin here, this trigger retaining pin. That is in a different location. And if you'll remember, while the Max trigger wasn't exactly a godsend, the Chief's was, yeesh. We certainly noticed some differences there, and as a matter of fact, the only difference in the part schematic you'll find between these two tools is the triggers. It would appear Chief is using a more traditional plunger valve that sort of just pushes back into the number 6 valve body here, whereas Mac is using a spring from the air inlet end design, indicating a sort of tilting throttle design. Check out this cutaway example of two of these types of throttles that we're showing that was sent to us after discussing this with the manufacturer. On the right, the spring sort of supports a gate that can sort of be wobbled open incrementally with leverage from the trigger, allowing it to crack open gradually. On the left, the spring goes here and the valve is just open sort of all at once you overcome that air pressure that's on the back side of the trigger stem. But this trigger assembly on the right represents more of an obstruction, which usually requires this area being a bit bigger to allow for more flow because of that spring and stuff in the way. Which does partially explain the small but measurable power difference we saw today, and why higher air pressure helped to close that gap, forcing its way around those extra parts more easily. In case you're not aware, Mac Tools is owned by the long arms of SBD, Stanley Black & Decker, and Stanley is the sort of sourcing arm for Mac. There aren't exactly Stanley factories in Taiwan cranking out their own air hammers. They're having it made by a factory who already makes very good air hammers, and well, as it turns out, Chief decided to do the same thing and or with the same factory, and they were allowed to do so by throwing money at them, or some deal they had with SBD expired, or whatever, we have no idea. Either way, this would not be the first time we've tripped over Harbor Freight buying potentially the same tool from the same factory as a tool truck, and other tool trucks are not exempt from this accident. On our last right angle air impact episode, we tested the Matco MT2512 and found out its performance was really quite close to the Harbor Freight earthquake right angle, and after looking at their parts diagram, found the same mirror-like relationship there. Except in that case, both tools were a bit underwhelming, so Harbor Freight sort of had the right idea, but wrong application and copying a tool truck here with a less than ideal tool, in our opinion. In this Chief's case, they ended up adopting what was really a powerhouse of an air hammer in the Mac MPH 1911, Even though their website is useless, as usual, comparing it to an old Astro Tools air hammer kit that's completely different at the same price as the Mac that they could have compared against. We should mention this is sort of a newer phenomenon from Harbor Freight we've seen introduced in the last couple years on a few models. I wouldn't go walking around the store and expect to see tools that look like the same as tool trucks to be the same as tool trucks. You'll be headed down the wrong road in that case. But we still haven't sort of met the objective of this episode. How does a tool truck's air hammer, power-wise, compare to one from retail? Because we've tested a tool truck air hammer and a tool truck air hammer in black, really. So let's see how the IR119 Max, the highest performer you can buy online, from what we've tested, looks up against these two. Here's its max run. $3,946, a bit down from the tool truck design. Okay, and here's the BCS at a higher pressure. That IR wakes up a lot from higher pressure and about matches the tool truck air hammer pretty closely, with the Chief edging it out a bit. But at $133 and better trigger control, much better than Chief, you can see why it's still at the top of our rank chart for now. That said, sure looks like the Chief and this IR are the best buys so far. We'll have to find out as we test more exclusively only found on a tool truck 401 shank air hammers from Snap-on and Matco to find out. Subscribe to come along for the journey if we haven't already been thrown into a van with a bag over our heads for even publishing this information, and check out our Amazon and T-Store links below so that we might afford bail. Thanks for watching.